The thing that happened that really precipitated a perception on the part of many of us that we needed a new textbook is when the College Board changed their AP U.S. History standards in a direction that was just kind of mind numbing, de-emphasizing the Constitution, the Constitutional Convention, the founders, and it they backed off from that. There was a group of us. I was very much a part of this that wrote a letter asking them to reconsider their standards. They never acknowledged the letter, but they did back off. But we could see the handwriting on the wall. The European exam similarly has become politicized. So we saw there was a need for a balanced, accurate, fair-minded, non-political textbook. And when people started asking me if I would be interested in doing it, I said, "Oh, no way! I would rather be writing my scholarly monographs and that kind of thing." And I think it's a great idea. I hope you find someone to do it. But eventually, it sort of dawned on me that I'd been complaining about history instruction in textbooks and this sort of thing, both orally and in print, for years. And when was I going to do something about it instead of just complaining? So it was a kind of seizure of conscience, you could say, that caused me to do it. Once I got into it, I enjoyed it thoroughly, and it was something I did by myself. I mean, I didn't have any research assistants. I had my wife, who is extraordinary as a harsh but sympathetic reader, and so everything went through her, and a number of other people, but mostly family members, not professional historians. But I based it on the years and years I've been teaching the history survey course. So I kind of knew what I wanted to do and how I wanted to do it. So it's a very accessible a book that's written to be read. I think that's one of the distinctives about it, and I insisted on doing it that way. I didn't want to have a lot of sidebars, a lot of gizmos and gimmicks. I wanted to have a readable book. And so far, I'm just kind of astounded at how good a reception it's gotten. It was beyond my hopes even, let alone my expectations. Yeah, it does. And one of the things that it's become an ongoing thing because we had to do a teacher's guide. It's a funny story. Roger Kimball, I had sort of suggested we might need to do a teacher's guide. And encounter, they don't do this kind of thing. So no, we don't need to do that. And then Roger's wife was in a reading group, and there were teachers in the reading group, and they read Land of Hope, and they said, "We love this. We'd love to use this, but we need a teacher's guide." So his wife came home and said, "You need to do a teacher's guide." So we need a teacher's guide. So we've done that. Very good. I think teacher's guide we did rather quickly, and now we're in the process of putting out a student workbook to accompany that. So we've got all that nailed down, and now I'm working on a young readers edition, which is really designed for 5th, 6th graders, when in many states where students are first exposed to U.S. history. So And that's fun too, because you really have to whittle things down to the essentials, and it's a good mental exercise to do that. So, but I'm excited about that too, and it's sort of taken over my life, although I don't think it will permanently. But I do a lot of speaking engagements, and the book is catching on in charter schools, private schools, religious schools, a few public schools. I mean, well, charters are public schools, but sort of standard public schools. But that's going to be the toughest part, because they're very committed to certain kinds of networks of things. And Pearson which is the biggest of the textbook publishers, is actually going to a all online mode of distribution. They're eventually not going to have books. They're already doing digital first, and a lot of schools are going to become wedded to that digital format. We still believe in books, and we hope that a lot of the evidence is that students learn more from books than they do from reading off of screens. It's actually pretty uncontrovertible. So we're hoping that in time more people will recognize that, but there's a sizable contingent that feel as we do. There's the land part, actually. It's not I don't subscribe to the notion that America is primarily an idea. I think we are an idea, but we're also a country. We're also a land that has a specific history, and that learning that history is part of what being a citizen is about. And I had in the back of my mind in all these materials the preparation of young people for citizenship. So that's really what's one of the things I had in mind with Land of Hope. But hope, that's obviously the key noun. And I think America is best understood as an aspirational nation. We are an aspirational people. To understand America, it's not enough to tote up the data, the statistics in nice, neat columns. You have to look at a kind of spiritual quality, for lack of a better term. Maybe it's not always. Sometimes it's in the drive to be the best and the wealthiest and whatever. But that's part of hope too. What is American, it seems to me, about this is that we are a people that are committed to the idea that no one should be confined to the conditions of his or her birth. That everyone should have opportunity to rise in the world, in the running room, within a free society and a free economy, to do that. So, and that's one way of thinking about hope. Hope is not acquiescing in the hand you've been dealt, but entertaining the hope that something better can be found or can be arrived at. So I think that even through our worst times, and even African Americans who came out of the experience of slavery, there's still there is W.E.B. Du Bois has a wonderful description of this, which I have in the teacher's guide at length, of how the sorrow songs, the spirituals, are animated by a sense of hope. So you find it popping up everywhere. As part of our sort of national legacy. Part of the invitation part is to say, this is not the last word. This is the first word, maybe for some of you. But, an invitation to a dinner party is not the dinner. It's merely the ticket that gets you in the door. And so I'm not making claims for this to be the great definitive narrative of American history. I do think it's an inviting, an invitation should be inviting. It should be something that excites your interest and your curiosity. And I think, these textbooks and I know some of the people who write them and contribute to them, they're well-meaning people. But they don't understand how deadening and how dead. There are two problems with textbooks. One is that they're ideologically tainted, particularly after 1960 or so. But I think a worse problem is how horribly written they are. They're written with an eye towards the various committees and hoops that stakeholders and interest groups that have to be placated in the process of getting to a textbook adoption in the big states like California, Texas, New York, Florida, so on. So that's why I emphasize I did this all by myself, really. And thank goodness at Counterbooks, they let me do that. They didn't sit over my shoulder and say, well, gosh, this is good. We might be able to sell more books if we kind of moderated this or that. And no, they didn't do that at all. They left me completely free, in a way that no other textbook publisher or publisher would have, and no other textbook author, I think, can claim to have been as free as I was. Which means anything that's wrong with it is my fault. Throw your pies at me. I want to emphasize this, that I think we do our young people, maybe our whole society, a great disservice by failing to see and point out and acknowledge the elements of greatness, of incomparable greatness in our history, along with an honest reckoning with our many faults. And the book is full of faults, and it's not a sermon one way or the other, but it is not a prettifying of the American past, and particularly slavery, Indian removal, the general shameful history of treatment of the indigenous peoples. That's all in there. Maybe not at the length that some people would like, who would like to make that the focus. But one of the things I'm going to say tonight is that we have to be, the great American story is a story that needs to be told. I fear that young people are only getting what I call the inglorious story. The story of America as a land of perfidy and malice and oppression and injustice. And while you can find all of those things, the question is that the overall theme? Is that what we want to, the image of ourselves that we want to have, that we want to convey to the young as a way of giving ourselves the material to move forward? I think not. I think I would say, going to go out on a limb, I cite in my talk tonight some statistics relating to rates of suicide among young people that have gone up exponentially in the last 10 to 15 years. Look, I'm not going to claim that this is all because of bad textbooks. That would be silly. But it may have something to do with the sort of disillusioned air you find among many of the young, that they've been fed a steady diet of very negative views about that from which they came. So we need to turn that around. That's a disservice to ourselves, to our young people, to everybody. I had no idea the 1619 project was coming when I published this, which was in May of 2019, so it was well before the 1619 thing appeared. I think the 1619 thing is so unfortunate. It's such a missed opportunity, because I'm all for the idea of emphasizing that the history of African peoples in America, in the Americas, and particularly in what became the United States, is not an asterisk. It has a central importance. Du Bois, in this passage I was just quoting, he says, that before the Pilgrims came, we were here. And it's true. 1620, 1619, and it's figuratively true also. So it's something that I think we could have had an observance of the year 1619, which it's actually, to get into the historical weeds a little bit, it's not clear that they were enslaved. It's not clear they remained enslaved. They were almost, I think more than likely they were indentured servants from the time they landed in Jamestown. And one of them went on not only to become free, to himself be a slaveholder. It's kind of astonishing that none of this detail found its way into the awareness of those who put it together. But as you probably know, and your listeners probably know, there's been a lot of criticism of the 1619 Project's historical inaccuracies. And basically the Times and the chief editor and the person who put the project together have simply failed to deal with those challenges, that's part of what scholarly discourse is about. If you make a bold claim, you back it up. You listen to the arguments from the other side. Now they just dismissed them. So it was very bad behavior, bad history, bad all around. And they've even erased some of the incorrect language from the website without telling anybody they were doing so. And no, it's just been a shameful performance, but it could have been a great thing. The observance of 1619, a celebration of the role of African Americans in building this civilization. I wondered about that because there's a lot of warts in there, and I end the book on a somewhat mordant note, talking about how divided we are, and talking about one of my particular concerns, obsessions, the size of the national debt and the lack of any interest from any political party. There's a few kooks like me out there who think, spending deficits of how many trillions have we incurred just to deal with COVID. We're already in territory where our debt service it won't be that long before it's larger than the gross national product or the gross domestic product. This is very worrisome. So I don't end up with a rendition of Stars and Stripes Forever. I do hopefully say, these are not problems that are beyond our ability to solve. We've been in worse circumstances. And it wasn't all that long ago. It was in the 90s that we actually had balanced budgets. So it can be done. But one of the things I do also is that I really break off the narrative, the kind of close narrative with the end of the Cold War. And I present in the last full chapter the post-Cold War period as a period where we have been sorting out questions that were sort of put on hold about what sort of government we want to have, what kind of posture we want to strike in the world. Is that the United States sort of the world's policeman and the world's keeper of order? Should we be sort of turning things over to the United Nations, or are we in for a sort of restoration of the idea of the nation state, which is, and these are very current debates. But I felt, and I still feel, that we don't have enough perspective on all of that to really tell the tale in the same way that I would tell the tale about, let's say, the First World War, the Civil War, or the Jacksonian period, or whatever. So I really try to emphasize that as tempting as it is to do a lot with current history, as people say, that we don't really have much perspective on that, and that's valuable in itself for people to realize. A historical perspective is very different than a well-informed. I'm someone who doesn't like the expression that journalism is a rough draft of history. I think it's very rough draft. I have a much, and one of the few really negative reviews I've had really took me to task for this, but I have a much more favorable view of the presidents of the 1920s, the Republican presidents, even Harding, but certainly Coolidge. less so Hoover. I see Hoover much more as already a kind of assimilated to progressivism, but you look at the successes of those years, and I think we tend too much to cast the shadow of the Depression over them. So that would be one example. I mean, I don't think there were a lot of surprises, but every time I sort of work through what I think about Lincoln and the sort of sequence of things that I think are important for people to know about him, the more impressed I am with him. I think actually this is going to sound like nothing much, but I had to spend a lot of time with George Washington, and my goodness, I think I have underestimated him. He's even greater than I thought he was. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Some of the parts of the book that I spent the most time on are the parts that nobody pays any attention to, like the explorers, because I didn't feel that I had a good grasp of that. So I did, I spent weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks sort of reading, trying to kind of get a handle on that, so that I could then tell it briefly. That's the thing. The hardest thing in this book was what to leave out. That was the hardest thing, and I had novel insights that I just felt, well, this is not the place to explore these. Occasionally I do, but for the most part, I think I have to. I'm not inventing a radically different account of American history. I'm trying to restore some sense of this as a story, and so I kind of feel the way Jefferson said about the Declaration, that he wasn't trying to come up with anything original. He was trying to give a sense of the American mind. It's what I'm trying to do with Land of Hope is similar. I'm trying to restore and put into a more palatable form, informed by some of the critical scholarship of the last 30, 40, 50 years, a view of American history that can make sense to particularly young people. I mean, that's who this is really written for. It's for young people. Just yesterday, I had a student turn in a paper, and of course they turn these in online now. I never handle anything in this COVID era, but and he had a nice little note attached saying, that it just in passing saying that 2020 is probably the worst year in human history. And I know this kid. I know he wasn't kidding. I think he really sort of believes we're just going through this horrible time. And look, I'm not going to say that it's all hunky dory, but I wrote him back and said, there's an epigraph from John Dos Passos that I used to begin the book, in which he talks about the importance of, and it's something he wrote in 1941. In the world at war, the United States about to plunge into it, and he says, we need to learn to reach back to our past for nourishment, for sustenance, for insight, for wisdom, and not fall victim to what he calls the idiot delusion of the unprecedented now, capital N. In other words, that we live in a time, nothing has ever been like it is today. And this is something I really have to fight with students, is the notion that how can you have anything in common with an era in which there were no cell phones? or I mean, I've had kids say I can't even watch movies where the character's sort of stranded out in the beach house, because you want to say, why don't you just call somebody, call 911 on your cell phone? It's they have no sense of the difference of the past, and that's part of our job. I think is to give them that appreciation. But then once you get a handle on the difference of the past, then you want to look for the sameness of the past. That human beings, we can learn important things about the present and things we can apply by looking at both the mistakes and the triumphs of the past. Look at the particularly the wars, Civil War, Second World War. I think I do emphasize more than your standard textbooks the degree to which the United States or the Allies were really back on our heels, and the Union, how easily that war could have been lost, and this is something that is really news to most people. We lose a sense of the contingency of history, of the sort of that sense of how differently things could have gone, and therefore how much it matters what we do in the time that we've been given. But I think it's a terrible thing when a whole generation is deprived of heroes. And heroes can be flawed. We all are flawed. Some of us very flawed. And the whole spate of statue desecration that we've gone through recently. They've been pulling down statues of Lincoln. They've been pulling down statues of Frederick Douglass, the great black abolitionist. What is with that? Well, there's some way in which those individuals, and Lincoln, it's easy to find faults with Lincoln by our contemporary standards with regard to the belief in racial equality. Douglass, he came around to a more gradualist view about the abolition of slavery that I guess is not acceptable anymore. That you, if you held to that view, you're to burn in hell too. So there's a utter lack of imagination, of a historical imagination, historical consciousness in so many people, so many young people today, and it's history's been weaponized. The only point of studying history is to prove that you have a sort of credential for having been victimized or oppressed or whatever, or that you are a victimizer or oppressor. That's a rather shrunken category of analysis. Look, I don't ride this horse hard, but I'm pretty clear about the ways in which the progressive, capital P, progressive interpretation of American history, as opposed to the constitutional understanding, the framers' understanding, but that really deserves to be much more severely questioned than it is. In most history texts see American history as a process of us outgrowing the Constitution and outgrowing the conceptions behind that you find in the Federalist Papers, behind the Constitution, and the idea that conflict, for example, is endemic in human existence, and so the main thing you try to do is control it and channel it towards the public good rather than eliminate it. When Theodore Roosevelt and especially Woodrow Wilson come along, there's a sort of sea change in that attitude, and I think there are a lot of people who don't appreciate, the beauty of the American system of federalism. They see it as inefficient. Well, yeah, it is, But if efficiency is your only criterion, then I think you've lost something very important. So I'd like to see a greater degree of openness to the idea that progressive reforms have not really succeeded. A great many of them, they're entrenched. And I'm not going to be the one to argue for, let's say, abolishing Social Security or something like that. You won't. I wouldn't do that. I think actually that would be a radical rather than conservative reform. But I think, for example, with the New Deal, I think anybody who reads my book is going to see the New Deal was a very mixed bag, and a lot of parts of it failed miserably, and that we need to be aware of that. I'll tell you something else, and this was actually one of my discoveries, and it goes back to the 20s again. Coolidge gave a speech for the, I guess it's 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and it was it's a fantastic speech. It's one of the great unsung speeches. I have it in the teacher's guide to as one of the documents for students to now analyze, but it's also in the text of Land of Hope, a big portions of it. It is the argument against the Wilsonian progressive program, which was what the presidents of the 20s were elected to move away from, the normalcy. By the way, do you know who the first president in American history to get over 60% of the popular vote was? Warren Harding. And it was his revulsion against Wilson. Warren Harding looked like a president. Unfortunately, in other respects, he wasn't quite up to the job, but he also wasn't as bad as the Arthur Schlesinger and other accounts present him as. So, yeah, I'd like to see some of the cliches about progressivism and to use a term I don't use, but big government, rethought. They're not entirely wrong, but they're certainly not entirely right. I think there needs to be rethinking. I hope I can stimulate that.